Hello and welcome to part 4 of our read aloud of Armstrong Sperry's classic award-winning tale, Call It Courage. When we left off at part 3, Mafatu had just crashed on a mysterious island. He doesn't really know anything about it. He hasn't even really been conscious for much of his time on that island. His canoe crashed on a barrier reef as the ocean tides were pulling it towards that island, and his canoe is now lost. He has nothing at all except Uri and Kiwi, and he had just collapsed with exhaustion up on the beach near a stream when we left off in part 3. There was a fan of light spreading in the east. Mafatu stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment, he lay there motionless in the cool mosses, forgetful of the events which had cast him up upon this strange shore. Then it all came crowding back upon him, and he scarcely dared to believe that there was earth, real solid earth beneath him, that once more Moana the sea god had been cheated. He struggled to sit upright, then fell back upon one elbow. Uri lay close at hand, holding a robber crab in his forepaws, cracking the tough shell and extracting the meat with gusto. There was Kiwi, too, with his beak tucked back under his wing, in sleep. Kiwi, who had led his friends to this island. Mafatu pulled himself to a sitting position. The action called for more strength than he realized. He was giddy with thirst, and there was an odd weakness in his limbs. His right leg was swollen and painful. He remembered then that he had banged it against the coral when the canoe struck. He discovered there was a large gash on his calf. He must take care of it soon, for coral wounds were poisonous. The chuckle of the cascade of water reached his ears and made him aware of a stabbing need for water. He plunged his face into the pool and drank deeply. Then, prompted more by instinct than by conscious thought, he withdrew, to let the water run down his swollen throat sparingly and with caution. Its cool magic stole through his tissues, bringing with it new life and restoring force. He sighed and sank back on the mossy bank, relishing the strength that quickened his tired body. Soon he must find food. There were thousands of coconut trees on every hand, rich with green fruit, but Mafatu was not yet strong enough to climb. Later he would try it. Then he would make fire, too, and he must search the island to find out if it were inhabited. And there was a shelter to build. Oh, there was much to do. He hardly knew where to begin. But for now it was enough just to lie there and feel strength returning, to know that he was safe from the sea. The sea. He shuddered. Maui, god of the fishermen, had carried him safely across the ocean currents. "Uri," the boy muttered thickly, "we're alive. It wasn't all a bad dream. It really happened." The answering wag of his dog's tail was further assurance of reality. As Mafatu's brain cleared of cobwebs, a sudden thought brought him up swiftly. This silent island was not Tahiti. What island was it then? Did it? Oh, did it belong to the Black Eaters of Men? Were they even now watching him from secret places in the jungle, biding their time? He glanced about in apprehension. But the solitude was unbroken, save for the soft cooing of ghost terns and gentle plash of the cascade of water. On his left hand, far offshore, the reef boomed to the charging surf. The curve of the beach reached out like two great arms to enclose the lagoon. Coconuts and pondanoo trees trooped in shining legions to the very edge of the sea. A flight of green and purple parakeets flashed across the sky and vanished. There was no other sign of life. No voices of men, no laughter of children, no footprint in the sand. The volcanic peak that formed the background of this island rose perhaps 3,000 feet straight up out of the sea. It was the cone of a volcano long since extinct. From its base, ridges of congealed lava flowed down to the distant shore. Once, in the dim beginnings of the world, this mountain had belched forth fire and brimstone, spreading destruction over the land. But the forgiving jungle through fertile centuries had crept back up the slopes, clothing them in green and more green. The boy rose and stood, stretching his stiff limbs. The water had restored him, and he felt much stronger. But he found that the earth heaved with the sea's own motion, and he swayed to keep his balance. His legs still pained, and he would need the juice of limes to cauterize the coral wound, and purao leaves to make a healing bandage. Nearby was a tree loaded with wild limes. He plucked half a dozen of the fruits and broke them on a bit of coral, squeezed the juice into the open wound. He winced as the caustic stung, but when he had bound on the leafy bandage with a twist of vine, it seemed that already his leg felt better. Soon the swelling would be gone too. Close at hand, he discovered a rude trail made by a wild pigs and goats in their wanderings across the mountain. The trail led up through the foothills to a high plateau, which the boy decided would make a splendid lookout. From that point of vantage, he would be able to survey his entire island and the sea for a distance of many miles. He followed the path where it led back into the jungle along the course of the swift-flowing stream. The trail sloped up sharply, and Mafatu pulled himself up by roots and trailing lianas vines, now climbing, now crawling flat on his stomach. He found that he had to stop every now and then to catch his breath. Uri ran beside him, dashing off on this scent and that. The dog's shrill, sharp bark shattered the morning stillness. For a quarter of a mile the coconuts held, beautiful trees that were more luxuriant than any in Hikaru. It was always thus in the rich soil of the volcanic islands. Then came a belt of breadfruit and wild bananas, of oranges and guavas and mangoes. The roots of the mape trees, the island chestnut, twisted over the ground in strange, tormented shapes. Vines trailed like aerial ropes from the high branches where orchids bloomed, while little parakeets fled on swift wings and vanished in the green gloom. Oh, we've got an announcement.
All Fryak is the office. All Fryak is the office.
Mafatu had never before seen woods like these, for Hikaru was opened and windswept. These endless legions of trees seemed to close in upon him, imprison him with reaching arms, with heady odors, with eerie light and shadow. Ferns grew higher than a tall man's head. The roof of leaves was powdered with starry blossoms. By the time Mafatu reached the plateau, he was exhausted, and his leg throbbed with pain. He lay down full length upon the volcanic rock and watched wild goats leaping from peak to peak high above his head, and heard their shrill bleating in the clear air. When he caught his breath, he sat up again and looked about. The plateau appeared to divide the island into halves. From his vantage point, the boy could see its whole circumference. He was hoping desperately for some sign of human habitation, yet fearing it too, for who knew whether humans might prove friends or enemies. He almost hoped the island were uninhabited and empty. But if it were, he shivered as he realized his isolation. Even at sea in his small canoe, he had not felt so utterly alone as he did here on this strange high island. Everything about it seemed alien and forbidding. He stood there looking off to the southwest, and all at once his heart gave a jump as he strained forward. A cone shape, vague as a cloud upon the horizon, showed him the existence of another high island. It must have been some 50 miles distant. As the boy watched eagerly, scarcely daring to believe the testimony of his eyes, he saw what might have been a column of smoke lifting high into the air from the peak of the cone. He had heard Grandfather Ruao tell of the smoking islands, the home of savage tribes. They were the dark islands of the Eaters of Men. Was that distant island one such? Perhaps this very island upon which he stood belonged to them too. It was a terrible thought. As he stood there surveying his world, the wind swept up from the wide Pacific, beat hard against him, whistling in his ears. Almost he had to lean against it to keep his balance. It was a southwest wind that blew straight from the smoking island, whipping the sea to anger. Inside the barrier reef, the water deepened and shoaled in changing hues. Up here, the whole world seemed consumed with light and color. Far off, a mist of gulls drifted above the breaking surf, their hoarse cries as unceasing as the hum within a shell. Towering above Mafatu's head, the basalt cone of the island looked as soft in hue as an amethyst, broken and worn by 1,000 years of wind and storm. He observed that the barrier reef encircled the entire island. There were only 2 openings in the reef through which canoes might enter. One opening lay on the other side of the island where Mafatu had been cast ashore. The other was here to the southwest, facing the distant smoking island. In each case, the opening was caused by a river which flowed from the mountain down into the lagoon. For the tiny coral polyp which builds up its ramparts from the floor of the sea cannot withstand fresh water. Wherever a river flows into the sea, there will be a breach in the barrier reef. Mafatu jumped in alarm as a wild boar crashed through the undergrowth. It was so close that the boy caught a glimpse of its dark hide. Uri leapt in pursuit, barking furiously. Mafatu relaxed, and a smile crossed his face. Pig roasted underground in the hot oven stones of the Amu? Aye, His mouth watered at the golden prospect. He would make a spear and kill the pua. That's what he would do. He was fired with excitement and set for the adventure. Then the thought of killing a wild boar in single-handed combat struck him dumb with wonder. Why, he never would have dreamed of such a thing in Hikaru. He was Mafatu, the boy who was afraid. He set his jaw with fierce resolution. He had never known a man who killed a wild pig. But Grandfather Ruao, who had traveled as far as distant Tahiti, had told how the warriors of that island killed pigs in the mountains with nothing but a knife for a weapon, bracing themselves so that the animal impaled itself upon the blade. It needed a strong arm and a stouter heart. Could he, Mafatu, ever accomplish such a feat? Grandfather brought back with him a necklace made from the curling tusks of the boar, and Mafatu could remember to this day how the dark blue scrolls of tattooing on the old man's copper flesh set off the handsome ivory teeth. That necklace was the envy of every man in Hikaru, and its possession earned Grandfather much respect. "I will make such a necklace for myself from the tusks," the boy promised bravely. "And when I return to Hikaru, men will look up to me and say, 'There goes Mafatu. He killed the wild boar single-handed.' And Tavana Nui, my father, will be filled with pride." The prospect of returning home set another train of thought in motion. "I must find a tree, a tamanu for my canoe," the boy said aloud. "I'll burn it out, and then make an adze of basalt to finish it. I'll plait a sail of pondonews, and oh, it will be a wonderful canoe." At that moment his eye fell upon a mango tree loaded with juicy fruit, and he plucked one and sank his teeth into the rosy pulp. For a few seconds while he ate his fill and the juices ran down over his chin, he forgot all about his canoe, forgot that he needed shelter, forgot that he needed food, fire, and weapons. But then, his hunger satisfied, his mind ran ahead again to the happy day when he would set sail for Hikaru, with all his demons put to rout, and the bright flame of courage burning in his heart. Never again would he be called Mafatu, the boy who was afraid. He stood there taut with purpose, high above the demon sea. "Maui, God of the fishermen, hear me," he pleaded. "I shall return home one day. I swear it. My father Tavana Nui will be filled with pride at my homecoming. It is a vow that I take now, O Maui. I have spoken." The wind from the sea swept up around him, its voice warm and soft and reassuring in his ear. Maui, God of the fishermen, seemed to have heard and answered. Mafatu decided that before he retraced his steps to his own beach, he would explore the opposite side of the island. The trail dropped from the plateau in a series of swift turns and spirals. The boy clambered down, slipping and sliding, catching hold of roots and vines to keep from falling. Far below, a cool, dark stream wound its way through a sheltered valley. Perhaps in that valley he would find some people. At the base of the ancient crater, long ridges of lava descended to the valley. All of a sudden, Mafatu remembered an old tale out of his childhood. He had been told how the youths of Tahiti slid down the cooled lava slides on sleds of giant leaves. Now that means the lava that has cooled down to solid rock, not still molten lava. Just to clarify, he's not about to jump into liquid lava. The thought had scarcely struck him before he was wrenching off half a dozen great leaves from a nearby banana tree. Even as he did so, he stopped, suddenly alert. They were splendid trees, 3 times his own height, with broad leaves that waved in the wind like tattered banners. But what caught and held his attention were the stems where the fruit had grown. They had been severed cleanly by a knife. His heart gave a great thump and hung fire. He examined the stems with care. Tree after tree had been stripped of fruit, and within a week, too. Who had cut these bananas? Well, he would have to find out. His lips were grim as he set about making his sled. He bound the leaves together with a fibrous rope of vines and soon had a toboggan as long as his body. When Mfatu reached the lava slide, he set his sled in place and flung himself down upon it. With a shout and a shove, he was off. Down the natural slide he sped at a terrifying speed. Trees whizzed past and wind drove the air from his nostrils. The valley rushed to meet him. He brought up with a bump in a thicket of cassie bushes. As he extracted himself from the thorns, he was still breathing with excitement. Ay, but that was fun. He did not stop to think how he would get back to his plateau, for at that moment his eyes fell upon a broad, well-defined path leading through the jungle. "Ay," he exclaimed, "this fine trail was never made by the feet of wild pigs." The boy stood there, irresolute, uncertain. Some premonition of danger kept him poised, alert, and wary. He was half tempted to retrace his way and explore no further. But then an overpowering desire to know just who had made that path urged him onward. The trail led toward the sea, widening as it went. But soon it opened into a cleared circle where no trees stood anymore, some 100 feet in circumference. Involuntarily, Mafatu started forward, but then drew back with a sharp cry. What he beheld filled him with awe and sent his limbs trembling. He saw a series of wide stone steps rising in a pyramid shape many feet high. On top of this pyramid, a grotesque statue, an idol hideously ugly, reared in the brilliant sunshine. It was an ancient idol, for its contours had been softened with fungus and lichens, corroded by the rains of ages. The roots of convolvulus writhed about its base. No wind reached this hidden circle, and insects hummed in the hot air. Mafatu felt that he was being suffocated. His heart pounded. This was a marae, a sacred place. Scarcely daring to breathe, he advanced a step, then drew up short. Around the base of the idol he saw piles of bones, charred but not old. The platform was strewn with them. Bones too large for dogs, too large for pigs. And then Mafatu understood. His heart congealed and sank in his chest. This was a Motu Tabu, a forbidden island. It was here that the eaters of men made their terrible sacrifices. And that is where we will pause for part 4. So now we have at least a bit of an answer. This is not an island where the eaters of men live. It is the island where they come to make their sacrifices. Now, this may not seem like a good thing, but there was a silver lining to this news for Mafatu. When he found those banana trees, he noticed that the fruit had been cut with a knife, but recently. And because these eaters of men would not be making these sacrifices on a very frequent basis, if they had been there recently, it means they won't be back for some time. That means Mafatu at least has a chance to survive, build what he needs to return to Hikaru, and escape from this forbidden island. Now, whether or not he'll actually succeed in those tasks before the Eaters of Men come back, well, you'll have to join us next time as we continue with part 5 of Call It Courage.